Yeah. I'm Adam. I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Idaho, and my dissertation research is focused on trying to understand the controls of wildfire and boreal forest and tundra ecosystems. Now, my dissertation research, or why I'm interested in this research, is because I'm interested in answering questions of how are fire regimes currently responding to ongoing climate changes, and how may they respond to changes in the future. And why I'm interested in this in boreal forest and tundra ecosystems, or why other people might be, is because of the significant quantities of carbon stored in their soils. Now, historically, these systems have been carbon sinks, but there is the potential for them to transform to carbon sources. And so altered fire regimes in these systems may have global impacts as well as local impacts. Now, the focus of my dissertation research is to answer questions such as what are the important factors that control fire in these systems, what are the important climatic factors that we need to consider, vegetation factors, topography, things of that nature. And not only what factors are most important, but what are the nature of these controls? What is the shape of the fire-climate relationships? How do different variables interact with each other to control fire in these systems? And then using this knowledge of what has controlled past variability in fire activity across both space and time in these systems, what does this tell us about what might happen in the future in response to climate changes? Now, to date, most of my work has focused on Alaska, looking at the controls of fire at multi-decadal timescales. But this research is sort of wrapping up. It's coming to an end. And so we're beginning to expand this research to the biome scale, looking at the controls of fire across the boreal forest and tundra biomes. Today, I'm going to share with you mostly research from Alaska, as this is the most complete work to date. But I will just try to give you kind of like a hint or a sneak peek of where we're going with this in the future at these larger spatial scales. And so in Alaska, our study area are regions dominated by boreal forest and tundra vegetation, which you can see on this map here denoted by different colors, where the gray areas are not in our study area. You'll also notice red areas, where this indicates pixels that have burned at least once from 1950 to 2009. And so what we're looking here, or what I'm trying to do specifically in Alaska, is evaluate what is controlling the spatial variation in fire activity, specifically at 30-year timescales. And so we're comparing, we're looking at areas that have burned and comparing them to areas that have not burned. So kind of a presence-absence approach. And using this presence-absence approach, we're able to look at the probability of fire occurrence in the systems, or model the probability of fire occurrence in the systems. And you'll notice that I'm looking at 30-year timescales here, even though I have 60 years of available data. There's two reasons for this. The first reason is this essentially allows me to split up my data set into testing and training data sets, so to evaluate the models that I'm building. And this also allows me, we felt 30 years was a more relatable timescale to climatological averages, to how climate is changing in that sort of sense. And so more specifically, how we model the probability of fire occurrence in these systems is with machine learning tools or statistical models called boosted regression trees. And the strength of the boosted regression tree is that it allows you to capture complex, nonlinear, interacting relationships between response and explanatory variables. Our explanatory variables, in this case, were 30-year climatological averages of temperature of the warmest month, which I'll just refer to as summer temperature from here on out. Annual moisture availability, which is simply precipitation minus potential evapotranspiration, topographic relief, and vegetation type, which is a categorical explanatory variable. And we stratified our analysis spatially by both boreal forest and tundra vegetation. And then for each one of these spatial stratifications, we created 100 boosted regression tree models. And so we went ahead and after multiple modeling iterations, we were consistently finding that these models performed relatively well and that they had predictive power. And we evaluated this through two different methods. The first method was we compared the predicted versus observed fire rotation periods, where the fire rotation period is the amount of time it takes to burn an area equal in size to an area of interest. And in this case, our area of interest were ecoregions, which you can see on this map here, denoted by the different polygons. And the colors on these maps indicate different fire rotation periods, where darker colors indicate shorter fire rotation periods. And so here, this is just kind of an example in these maps of how we're comparing them. And over here on these figures, this is a more quantitative approach to evaluate model performance, where on the y-axis we have the predicted fire rotation period, and on the x-axis we have observed. And you can see that if these models were perfect, they would fall in this one-to-one line. They're not, but they seem to be doing well. Another way we evaluated these models was with an AUC value, which I won't go into detail here, but if it's above 0.5, that indicates that the model does have some predictive power. And so we went ahead and we see these models are doing well, and now we want to understand what variables are these boosted regression trees using most often to explain the spatial variability in fire occurrence in Alaska. And we found that climate was the most influential or most important variable. And so on this y-axis here, we have variable importance, which is just very simply the number of times a variable is chosen by the model to partition areas where fire is more prevalent versus where it is less prevalent. And we can see that in both boreal forest and tundra, climate is the most important explanatory variable. Whoops, sorry. But there are differences between boreal forest and tundra, where in boreal forest we see that both summer temperature and annual moisture availability seem to have equal importance or relatively equal importance, while in tundra, summer temperature is the most important variable. And so seeing that these climate variables seem to be the most important, we can take a closer look at their relationships. And I'm going to show you here an example from summer temperature, where on the y-axis here, we have the probability of fire occurrence at 30-year timescales. On the x-axis, we have summer temperature. And we notice a few things right off the bat here. First, we notice that there's this positive relationship between the probability of fire occurrence and summer temperature. And this, I'm sure, is not surprising to anyone here. But what we thought was more interesting were these nonlinear relationships and what we perceive to be potentially climatic thresholds to fire occurrence, right around 14 degrees C in both boreal forest and tundra. And why we thought this was more interesting, or why these thresholds were interesting, is because this suggests that there are regions in Alaskan boreal forest and tundra that climatically could be right below these thresholds. And relatively small climatic changes could result in relatively disproportionate changes in the probability of fire occurrence in the future. So the response to climate might be relatively quick. And so we're looking here at summer temperature. We can look at how this is interacting with moisture. And we see that there are these strong interactions in both boreal forest and tundra. And so on the y-axis here, again, we have vertical axis, we have the 30-year probability of fire occurrence. On this axis, we have summer temperature. And on this axis, we have annual moisture availability. And we see that, so just to kind of orient you, in this back corner are the warmest, driest regions of Alaskan climate space, and down here are the coldest, wettest regions. And we see that there is a strong interaction where the warmest, driest regions at these 30-year timescales are the most susceptible to burning. And while, again, this might not be terribly surprising, related to these thresholds is we see that these relationships are relatively complex, and that this ultimately suggests that spatially that the response to climate change may be complex as well. And because this will depend, how fire regimes in the future respond to climate change will depend not only on how temperature changes, how moisture availability changes, but the current proximity to these thresholds. And so regions down here, if they're could experience an increase in temperature, but potentially decrease if moisture availability increases enough. And so we've looked at these relationships, we've taken a good look at them, and now we can take a look at what do these tell us about how fire regimes may respond to future climate changes. So real briefly, I'm going to show you some projections for climate change in Alaska. And so I'm sure most people here are quite familiar with these types of figures, but each of the different colors here represents projections from a GCM that's been shown to perform relatively well in Alaska. And then we have each of these lines. But you see there's two different lines, and that just, there's one for boreal forest and one for tundra. And on the y-axis here, we have the relative change from the 1950 to 2009 average for both summer temperature and annual moisture availability. And you see that, as most people are familiar with, steady increases throughout the future in temperature, but moisture availability is more uncertain, is more variable. But just to kind of highlight, we do see that at least in the beginning part from 2010 to 2039, there seems to be increases, or at least some agreement there's going to be an increase in moisture availability. But as you go throughout the 21st century, it does become more variable. And so we drove our boosted regression tree models with these climate change projections from these 5 GCMs. And we evaluated the level of agreement from these 5 models on whether there would be an increase or decrease or no change, essentially. And so the red areas, red pixels, indicate areas where at least 4 of the 5 GCMs projected a increase in the probability of fire occurrence of at least 25% relative to the historical period. Blue areas represent areas where at least 4 of the 5 GCMs projected a decrease in the probability of fire occurrence of at least 25%. And gray areas either indicate areas of low agreement among the models, so less than 4 GCMs agreed on a particular direction of change, or there was little change, which we consider to be less than 25% increase or decrease. And now, interestingly, you'll notice that if we look at the boreal forest here, in the beginning part of the 21st century, which we're currently in, we see that it's projecting decreases in the probability of fire occurrence. And there's good agreement among the models for this. There's also a lot of uncertainty as well, but you see all this blue area. And we can relate this to that initial increase in moisture availability that we saw in the previous slide. But we'll notice that as we go through the 21st century for both boreal forest and tundra, that there's more and more agreement that areas will experience an increase in the probability of fire occurrence in these boreal forest and tundra ecosystems. And so we've kind of looked at these relationships. And so I'll just show you quickly what we're doing in the future. So we're going to expand this from Alaska because this takes up a relatively small area of the entire biome itself. And we're going to look using remote sensing data at these relationships at these larger spatial scales, although we do have less years to work with. And so in conclusion, we were able to find that at these 30-year timescales, climate explains a large part of the variability in fire occurrence across Alaska, that these relationships are relatively complex with nonlinearities and interactions, and that this ultimately suggests the response to climate change will be complex as well, both spatially and temporally. With that, I'd like to acknowledge funding and various institutions. And then if you are interested in this work, just tell you go see Paul Duffy's poster on Friday morning. And with that, thank you.
We have time for a few questions. Adrian?
Seems like there's a big increase in the fire activity in the Brooks Range, but there's not a lot of vegetation there. So does your model account for the lack of vegetation in that part of Alaska?
No, so that's one of the, so we did try to incorporate vegetation as explanatory variable in the model, which included barren tundra, which would have been in that area. But relative to climate, it had such little influence. But that's not to say that, vegetation is not important. So this is definitely one of the limitations of this modeling approach. And so if, more vegetation did occur in the future relative to climate changes, that response is going to be different. So this is definitely one of the limitations of this kind of correlative approach. We're not accounting for vegetation changes, changes in permafrost, things of that nature. So this is strictly based on climate change. Yeah.
Sure. You first, then you. Quick. Sorry.
I'm sorry, so we chose, yes, because there is evidence from these boreal forest and tundra ecosystems that previous winter's precipitation can have an influence on the following fire season. So we wanted to include the total moisture availability for the entire year through the fire season. Yeah.
Cool. Real quick.
So how do you deduct your gate period into training period and you want to make a model? Did you just stick it up and up?
I'm sorry, I can catch it.
How did you choose which part of the data record is going to be made a routine model or which one is going to be used for training?
Okay, for this, we did this 100 times, and each time we took a random subset of years, so we didn't take any one continuous 30-year period. We took random 30 years from 60 years and took the other 30 years not used in the initial subset to train on. So.
Do you have a question? Yeah. Go ahead. Oh, sorry.
You didn't account for large-scale climate variability such as PO and these effect on forest fires?
No, we haven't evaluated those potential influences.
Oh, it seems that most of these fires are driven by lightning, and I was wondering if there's any way you accounted for ignition changing as you had with the precipitation over the simulation period.
We did try to include lightning data from Alaska into these models, but there was it didn't cover the whole period, and then we weren't able to use it effectively. There were a few pixels with very high lightning density scattered all throughout, and then a lot of pixels with very low lightning density. So the model it wasn't able to use it effectively. But yeah, we did consider ignition sources.
Great.